there too. So you should probably keep your eyes peeled for those questions that are relevant.
Anna, I will be feeding those to you specifically through the private message function.
Perfect.
So it's 12:02, so I think we'll just get started. For those who don't know, my name is Jim Tung. I'm a member of the ACS Portland section and also a member of the steering committee for the Oregon Science Startup Forum. So hello again. This week we have 5 panels. This is the 4th, How to Fund Your Startup. Tomorrow we have Practice Your Pitch. So 2 startup companies will be pitching in front of our panel of experts: Rita Hansen of Onboard Dynamics, Genevieve Marshall of Arventurine, and Skip Rung of Onami. The direct link will be emailed to you at 11:50 tomorrow, and don't forget to use the chat function to ask your questions to the panel. I'd like to thank our sponsors: Onami, AppSci, Otrati, Illumina, the Berglund Center at Pacific University, and Virtue Lab. Today, I have the honor of introducing Anna Brown, who is our moderator. I've really enjoyed getting to know her as an OSSF attendee and panelist over the last 4 years. She's a chemical and materials entrepreneur based in Portland. She completed her graduate work at Portland State University and postdoctoral research at OHSU College of Pharmacy. She's currently the founder and CEO of Stark Street Materials Corporation and working to commercialize the next generation of radiation shielding fabrics and materials. Thank you, Anna, for your time, and we look forward to this panel.
All right, thanks, Jim. So I'm excited to be here for the money episode of Oregon Startup Science Forum. So I'm going to actually let the panelists introduce themselves and give a little bit of their background, their expertise, and a little bit of their story. So I'll just go in order of what's on my screen. Brett Bosley, would you like to start us off?
Sure, thanks, Anna, and thanks, Jim. I'm Brett Bosley. I'm with Boron Specialties in Pittsburgh. You'll see my wife and our CEO is in one of the panels, I guess, to my right on the screen. So she'll tell you a little bit more about the company itself. My own career background is primarily with companies in the chemical or life science or research space, in ranging from venture-backed startups to publicly traded companies in roles that were both finance and general management oriented. I take care of finance here at Boron Specialties, and I occasionally also clean glassware and other important executive duties. And so happy to share some of our perspectives on our experience bootstrapping this company.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Leon, you want to start us off?
Hi, everybody, and I'm glad to be here. And as said, my name is Leon Wolff. I work for an organization in Oregon called Virtue Lab, which used to be Oregon Best and is a nonprofit that does essentially startup assistance and economic development, primarily for clean tech. But as a grant specialist, I work across all industries, including, of course, the chemical and material science disciplines that are relevant to today's talk. So again, Virtue Lab provides SBIR assistance across the state of Oregon. We're located in Portland, but we serve the whole state. My specialty is helping small businesses get a particular type of federal funding called SBIR and STTR, which stands for Small Business Innovation Research and Small Business Technology Transfer. And a little later, we'll tell you what the difference is. I started out in life as well, at least in career, as a chemical engineer. So maybe that's why they keep inviting me to these, because of sort of honorary cred. But I can't say I do too much chemical engineering now. I tend to learn a lot about a lot of different technologies and just sort of dabble in subject matter and really specialize in how to write a compelling proposal and understand the nuances of the different federal agencies that provide this funding. So the SBIR program is a great source of what's called non-dilutive capital and provides now almost $4 billion a year to startups, essentially small businesses that are past the basic research phase. This is not money for universities, but pre-seed or pre-venture capital stage. So it's often described as helping companies bridge the valley of death between research and commercialization. And we'll probably get a chance to talk or answer your questions a little bit more about that later. So I look forward to a lot of questions. The SBIR program is a great way, or at least I'm biased towards telling people it's a great way to fund startups if you can get it, but it's often very competitive and challenging to navigate the agencies. And I should make a plug now, and I will do so again at the end. My email is over here on the right, and we also sent out a sign up that if anybody has this particular technology and wants to learn more about its particular suitability for federal funding, there's a request out for one-on-one consult signups. So I look forward to talking to you then and answering your questions. Thanks, everyone. Sorry if that was a little bit long.
No, it was great. And I just want to give another plug for Leon. I've made use of these services and they're fantastic. Working with Leon is really extremely helpful. So highly recommend it, particularly if you're just starting out looking for an idea and trying to figure out how to formulate it. All right, Beth.
Oh, thanks, Anna. I've been very happy to be here on this How to Fund Your Startup panel. As my husband Brett said, we are co-founders of Boron Specialties. We are a bootstrapped chemical company outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. As you might guess from the name of our company, we generally work with things that have a boron atom in them, and even more specifically, most things that have boron hydrogen atoms in them. So these are pretty difficult chemistries in which I have a particular expertise from a long history of small businesses in the chemical industry, and have learned really how to scale up difficult chemistries. And that's one of the things that we do here quite well. We work in industries like electronics and energy, material science, aerospace, defense. Those are our main markets, a little bit of pharma, but mostly non-pharma businesses here. We've been in business for about 10 years now, and we're manufacturing every day low volume, high value chemicals.
Great, thanks, Beth. So I'd like to start off with you. If you could tell us a little bit about the pathways to funding Boron Specialties and how you basically got going, and with a specific emphasis on where the seed funding came from.
Sure. So we began very slowly. We actually started with just me consulting. That's how the business really got off the ground. There was a market need for a certain expertise in this difficult boron hydride chemistry. So that's really where I started, just alone with no lab or anything, just alone, working from home and consulting. And that business went fairly well. We then had the opportunity to distribute one product from some partners we have in Russia. And so once we had to distribute, then we had to find a facility to store the product. All we were doing was buying and reselling, so we didn't have to do anything in a lab. But that allowed us to find a facility that could at least store this product and we could ship from. And so that gave us a location. And that business was able to support a certain amount of leasing space. After that, we got some business in contract analytical in the boron space. So we have a partnership with a company who couldn't really do their own analytical, and they wanted us to do it for them. That precipitated us building our lab. And then from contract analytical, we went on through to making our own products. And all of that was funded with our own personal savings and then plowback of operating cash flow from the business. So because we started so slowly, so for 2 years, it was just me. Then we hired 1 employee and then 2 employees, but that was all done with operating cash flow from the business and our own personal savings.
Okay, so a good example of the bootstrapping.
Yes.
I'd add just one interesting little thing we discovered along the way, which is that Beth described that she was the the sole proprietor in early days, and I was continuing to work for a paycheck for a period of time, and we actually used a kind of a tax strategy almost to where the business might have been in an operating loss in a given year. That offset my income and essentially amplified our ability to reinvest in the business. So sometimes if you have a partnership like Beth and I do, you can translate that into some capital for the business as well.
Okay, great. And then Leon, I was hoping you could give us a quick, brief overview of what the early grant opportunities might be for different technologies, and then we'll get back to Brett and he'll talk about more advanced funding opportunities.
Certainly, yeah. So there's a lot I could say on the opportunities, but I'm sure we only have an hour, and I don't want to take quite a lot of any significant fraction of that. But so as I mentioned earlier, this particular federal program, which is only one of many different funding mechanisms from the federal government and its associated agencies, is SBIR, Small Business Innovation Research, and STTR. And the agencies are probably familiar to most people on the call. Department of Defense is the largest, Department of Energy, National Science Foundation, USDA, and some others are ones that often fund chemical and material science related research. And there's a lot more I could say about the opportunities and how they're published. The agencies tend to want to fund things that align with their mission, and they are sometimes released in very specific calls with very specific topics. And some other agencies, like National Science Foundation, have very broad topic areas and issue their funds as a grant, whereas some specific agencies, topic-specific agencies, issue their funding as contracts because they have a very specific need to fill. So this funding is typically given, it always is given directly to a small business, and it's typically given for what's called applied research at the start of a funding cycle, as opposed to quote unquote basic research, which is done at a university. It's really knowledge for knowledge's sake or discovery of a new phenomena that might have been theorized but hasn't been seen. SBIR grants, in contrast, are really supposed to be taking knowledge and applying it in service of demonstrating it's going to work in the real world and can actually be developed into a commercializable product. So very often, but not always, these grants are used to spin out university research or to at least collaborate with university researchers on some particular intellectual property or discovery. I would say that about 50% of the awards that I help to work on have a university involvement in some mode, whether it's a true spin out with IP from the researcher or a university-led startup or a university faculty-led startup, or others where there are just subawards. But it is not required for SBIR grants, which is the main program. However, the STTR vehicle, which is sort of a smaller companion program with many of the same sets of rules, has to be done in collaboration with a university researcher. And my co-callers, the Bosleys at Boron, I believe have a lot more extensive experience with doing an STTR. And if anybody has questions, I encourage you to ask them. But in all cases, what you're trying to do is a technology transition and basically pull the technology from a kind of benchtop lab scale or even a theoretical modeling scale to where it is essentially a representative demonstration of the feasibility. So as such, I work with many small companies that are just one or two inventors or an inventor and a founder that has more business experience. And they're really trying to use the money to get to this next stage where they're building several articles of prototyping or trying to prove that they can do something on a repeatable basis. In chemistry, you might have discovered a compound, but now you're developing a synthesis route or proving the efficaciousness that the compound does what it's supposed to do, for example, water purification or something like that. That's the stage that the federal government wants to seed startups. And I should have mentioned at the start of the call that the government is doing this in a non-dilutive way. They don't expect to be paid back or take an equity share, but they're doing this to seed high growth, high value jobs and revenue growth to keep the US competitive. So at a very broad macro scale, they want to see companies be successful and grow to become the next Qualcomm or Symantec or somebody paying a lot of taxes and giving a lot of jobs to Americans. So ultimately, this is about getting to market and commercializing a product. And very often that does require some more development and thoughtful research for someone before they write an SBIR proposal. That's about it for now, and I'll turn it over to the boron specialists.
Yeah, Brett, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what it's like to be on the industry side of an STTR proposal, and then as a sort of follow-up, what are some of the other funding opportunities sort of as a company moves forward for either strategic venture or private equity?
Sure, thank you. So one of the things that, there's a couple things that have been very good for us about this STTR, well beyond the funding itself. And as you heard Beth describe how we bootstrapped, it's different pieces of capital from where we can get them. And so certainly that was helpful and it continues to be. The project's still ongoing. But I think importantly, it's also strategically aligned with our core set of products and technologies and takes them in a new direction, which is particularly important in the kind of chemistries that we do. So that's helpful. And really stretching the boundaries of what some of these products can, in terms of performance, can do. And then the third thing I think is it's both enjoyable to some extent, but also important in our business model is that we're engaged with both UCLA and UC Riverside on this project. As Leon described, you have to have research university partners. We do this routinely around the world. We have academic colleagues and collaborators, and for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's for sourcing innovation, and in many cases they're also customers, but just engaging with them at a scientific level is an important part of our business. And so the STTR kind of formalizes that and really makes a collaboration out of the objectives of the grant. So switching gears a little bit, Anna asked me to talk a little bit about venture, and it's, as I mentioned at the beginning, something I've had some experience with on the company side, typically as the finance person. So being out there with the leadership team, raising money, and at various stages of company development, which is one important thing to keep in mind with venture type money. I think the one thing to keep in mind right at the outset is that this is a very rare kind of financing. It's something like 3% of all business starts in the U.S. Manage to get venture funding, and it's pretty clearly defined what kinds of businesses and business models VCs are interested in. You'll hear a word venturable, which is kind of if you hear it in the wrong context, it's a death knell. You know, you're not venturable, and sometimes it's hard for a small company, particularly at launch stage, to have the things that ring the bells of a venture capitalist. You may be aware that they look for things like a great team, right? And often, ideally, that's a team that's built companies and made money for investors before. Not always, but that's certainly a plus. Very proprietary technology with great economic potential and convincing them, and that's different than something that's a great scientific discovery. So again, to Leon's earlier point about kind of applied versus basic research. Relatively low technical risk. Probably capital efficiency is a consideration that's a little more difficult in a science-based industry where you may need to build a laboratory or you may need to hire 30 scientists and so forth. But the reason that a lot of venture money goes into IT is that it's capital efficient and typically very fast to return on investment. So that's a consideration as well. And it has to be in a sector that venture capitalists care about. Now, the nice thing in our broad industry, where of ACS colleagues and people that are involved in life science and so forth, is that biotechs are a pretty rich area for venture investment. There's a lot of synergy, both in terms of what biotechs need and what venture capitalists are looking for. So that's kind of a special area. And if that's your area, or just to a lesser extent, advanced materials is also a pretty strong interest. One final, just sort of general comment, and I'm happy to talk at length about any other things, maybe two other things I want to say. One is, in the chemical life science space, there's a fair amount of corporate venture capital, which is a little bit different kind of money, but it's complementary to the more classic venture funds that you may have seen or heard about. And if you're strategically aligned with a large company that happens to have an internal fund, can be a great way to engage with them and bring in some capital at the same time. And then the last comment I would make is that if you do think that you're venturable and it's something that you want to, it's a road that you want to start going down, there's a number of options for sort of access pathways. So they may range from, maybe working with an angel or a high net worth individual. I actually had the privilege one time of working at a chemical company that was funded by Alfred Bader, a very famous scientist entrepreneur who founded a company called Sigma Aldrich that you probably are all familiar with. You can work with incubators. At the high end, you might look at something like a Y Combinator, but there's a lot of regional or university-based incubators. And so forth. Regional venture funds, there's a lot of kind of on-ramps to the highest quality, big deal kinds of venture funds. And it's even in 2020 with all the dynamics of the economy, it's out there, there are deals getting done. And so if you're in the right space with the right technology, it's an option for you. But again, it's rare, high expectation, high bar to get it, and maybe not for everybody.
Okay, thanks, Brett. I have a few specific questions I'm going to ask the panelists, but I also want to make it very clear to the audience that you can insert your questions into the chat box, and we can, I will definitely filter those and then ask the panelists. So go ahead and enter your questions. So my question, and this is maybe kind of an odd question, but having recently gone through a number of grant processes and starting to vet my company for future investments, is what to fund and when. So what are maybe some of the specific milestones? What are some really early prototyping projects that would be useful to either validate the market or validate the technology? And I thought we'd start with Leon because he has a lot of experience with grant writing and probably dealing with scientists who have these questions in particular.
Thanks, Anna. That's a really great question, and I kind of jumped the gun and described some of that in the last round. But as mentioned, the SBIR and STTR grants, they really are at the same stage and are looking to fund more or less the same type of basic research. In a little bit more detail, the grants in nearly all cases are divided into a kind of an entry-level phase 1 grant everyone has to start at, which is typically in the range of $200,000. And then if you're successful at getting that award and executing on the research, you then apply for a phase 2, which is really where the big bucks are, often $1 million or more. And while the phase 1 is supposed to be essentially the fundamental demonstration or feasibility, it doesn't really go very far. It funds, 1 or 2 or 3 researchers and some benchtop work. The phase 2, the reason why you have that bigger money is intended to really shake out everything about the product development so that external investment can be made, such as the type that Brett was talking about. Presumably, you've gotten to a stage where most of the risk is gone, and now you're really just talking about buying capital equipment to manufacture or do some sales and marketing. It's usually a lot more complicated. So I know that, going from small volume prototyping to pilot or production volumes in the chemical world often involves a lot of risk. So I don't want to minimize that. But typically the government is giving out $1 million for a 2-year period for that phase 2, and they do expect you to essentially get all your invention done. So in the case of chemical research, that might be to do, like I said, a pilot scale. It might be much more about developing the manufacturing process instead of simply testing the finished chemical or product. It might be about doing margins testing, for example, at environmental corners or different temperatures for whatever the material or the reaction is going to be. But it's really designed to get all the quote unquote invention done. So again, I'd be happy to answer questions on the sidebar. It looks like there's a pretty challenging one. I think we might have to put that off a little bit till we've gotten through the standard questions. But anyway, hope that answers everybody's questions, and I'll turn it over again to the others.
Beth, I was hoping maybe you could talk about the very early stages of building your company and what you found to be worthwhile investments and what were investments you chose not to make early on.
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, we really started very slowly, so we didn't need outside investment. Certainly consulting is, as a one-person company, you don't need investment for that. When we went to distribution, we funded that ourselves based on the sales that we were generating with that distribution project. And one interesting way we found to help fund is when we started doing that contract analytical. So that was a corporate partner. They paid for the analytical equipment and we installed it and then charged them the labor to do the testing. But we didn't have to outlay the capital expenditure for that analytical equipment because they did. So that's a good way to sort of dip your toe, I guess, into the funding strategies where you're working with a corporate partner with whom you have some synergy and might be a long-term partner, maybe at some point may even be a potential acquirer. So that was one way we got a bit of investment, and that capital investment then helped us. You know, it wasn't that equipment wasn't only used for that one purpose. We were able to use that for our own purposes as well. So that's one bit of investment we took early on. Beyond that, we've looked at a number of SBIRs and STTRs over the years, and we applied for a few. I think we've only ever received one. But one caution I would say about SBIR and STTR is that it really should be laser focused and compatible with your company's strategy, because the government has topics that they're interested in. And sometimes you can look at a topic and you might be able to construe that is the right topic for your company to work on. But if it's not exactly what you want to do with your company, it can be distracting as well. So you want to be sure when you're looking at SBRs and STTRs that they won't consume time but not move your company forward. So that's one small caution about SBIR and STTR. The one STTR that we have has been very helpful. We've gotten a lot of research done. Not everything has worked as we planned, of course, but it's research, and so that there's some allowance for that in the DoD's thinking on their STTRs. So that was very useful. The one type of investment that so far we haven't taken, I guess two types of investment. We do have a lot of friends in the chemical industry, and some of those friends might be interested in investing in boron specialties to help us grow. And those are also then potential acquirers. We have not taken that investment yet, but we have talked to companies about investment and how that would look. And then the other one is private equity. We get a lot of calls from private equity because it's a pretty rare thing to start a chemical company in the year 2010 like we did. So people see that and are interested in investing. We haven't taken that investment yet either. So we still control our own destiny at this point.
Great. Thanks. And Brett, if you have anything to add to it, or from the other side of the funding table, what is fundable for specific projects or smaller milestones, or for actually building the company?
Well, I think Leon and Beth have talked about specifically the kind of structured milestones within the government programs, which again I would underscore are very valuable if they're aligned with where you want to go. Obviously, if you take venture investment, there are milestones essentially associated with that. Those are realized really through the board of directors that you will suddenly have and representing the interests of your investors. And they really relate to building value in the company. Everything is focused on the most accelerated creation of value. That may or may not mean revenue. It depends on what you're working on, but something that an acquirer is essentially willing to pay for to have your liquidity event, which is one of those terms that, again, if you're in that space, will become a very important phrase in your lexicon. So I think in the case of a venture-backed company, absolutely expectations about milestones, but they're really at the sort of existential enterprise level, and they're governed by the chief executive and the board, and from there on down. As Beth mentioned, in a bootstrap mode, we certainly have more control and flexibility, and that can be good or bad. We don't have the benefit of an outside board of directors, and there can be a lot of value in that. So we have to set our own goals, and we have to try to stick to them as best we can. And then on the downside of the approach that we've taken, we absolutely run into situations where we don't have quite enough oxygen to pursue a growth opportunity, for example, or to do it at the scale or in the time frame that we'd like to do. So everything's a trade-off, but you try to manage to your own goals, I guess, in our case, as best you can.
Anna, if you don't mind spending a little more time on this question, both Brett and Beth raised some really good points that I think our audience might have some interest in. And this question of trade-offs, and you need money, but you're not sure what it is you're going to have to agree to accept it, is a great point that Beth raised. And I see a lot of people, especially solo or just pairs of founders, who are like, we don't care, we just need money. And they're willing to make trade-offs. And it is something that you do have to enter in wisely, not just as far as how you need the money, but also in terms of what the funders are telling you as far as market need. And I always tell people, in the SBIR world, there's kind of the granting world. It's a bit of a nuance on the difference. There's the granting world where they're kind of interested in funding something. In the case of, say, National Institutes of Health, it has to be along their mission, but they're not really interested in buying the outcome. They want the medical community to benefit. But on the contracting side, such as the DoD grant that the Bosleys are getting, the DoD may very well be a customer for the product they're developing. So I tell people, whenever they start with DoD, it's like, it's a great big bucket of money, but you have to really double and triple check whether you're going into this with your eyes open. It's like, do you want the DoD to be your customer? And if the answer is yes, and you want to live your life as a defense contractor, then I tell them to go for it. But if the answer is no, and they're just kind of sort of using the money, I tell them to reconsider, because they're going to have to kind of do a lot, not even just whether or not the technical deliverables are required, but kind of learning the relationships and the nuances of the acquisitions within DoD, meeting mil specs, meeting requirements, even if they don't plan to commercialize the product themselves, but plan to license it, they still have to learn a lot of that. So there is an overhead which may not be worth it if you're not interested in being in that market. But I thought that was a great point, so thanks.
Okay, great. And so Brett or Beth, if you have anything to add to that, happy to open it up. But otherwise, this sort of led me into the next question for Leon. Oh, Brett, you have something you want to add? Okay. So Leon, my next question was going to be sort of specifically for you, and these talking about different government agencies and different granting opportunities. Who funds what? which agencies are looking for sort of what things, and maybe what's been sort of surprising to you to learn, or as entrepreneurs learn. I certainly was surprised what the Department of Agriculture was prepared to fund.
Oh, you stole the one thing I was going to say, Anna. Oh well, I have nothing else to add.
It's like I've talked to you before, Leon.
It's like, yeah. I don't know. I don't recognize the bayou that you're sitting in the background, though. You
I
seem
was
like a different
camping a
person.
couple of weeks ago, and this was a particularly well moss-covered tree I liked.
Oh, that's the Oregon woods. Okay, it's a great picture. But all right, back to serious things. So the question is, and I think it's certainly something to flesh out that the group might be interested in, is what types of funding is available specifically, perhaps for chemical technologies, and then what types of companies and projects do you get funded? And so I've already mentioned a few of the federal agency names, but just to recap some of the most relevant ones, there's Department of Defense with the biggest bucket of money. Department of Energy is fairly large and does have a fair amount of topics and interest in renewable energy fuels, as well as potentially things for fossil energy like fracking technology tools, as well as bioenergy. So there's definitely DOE. As Anna mentioned, USDA is certainly interested in both agricultural chemicals, as well as some things like agricultural commodities to fuel or to other bioproducts. So USDA has been a great source. And then National Institutes of Health, of course, is interested in pharma and other therapeutic products. And of course, National Science Foundation has a very rich program in chemical, biological technologies, material sciences, and environmental technologies that are all relevant to this group. So what I would say is the most surprise, I'm trying to think of one that's relevant to chemistry, and I'd have to say that it's probably the rural development. It's not relevant to chemistry, but it is kind of the rural development topics at USDA. In addition to helping the nation's farmers, USDA wants to help rural communities in general, and there's a lot of really interesting funding that's going on to help that. But maybe more on the chemical side, something that people often don't think about is in the food science areas. USDA has a very rich program in both food safety and food processing, and then value-added food products, including SBIR funding. So that might be something that is a little bit unusual, but interesting to the audience. I guess the final thing would be the for anybody in the medical world, don't overlook the Department of Defense, which spends a huge amount of its budget and a lot of its SBIR budget on specific medical technologies, including therapeutics, wound dressings, and other things that help the warfighter either in the field with trauma or with rehab. So don't overlook DoD, which, as I said earlier, is a huge bucket of money, almost $2 billion. And just really quickly, and I'll see if there's more time for this later, but what type of company and project gets funded? The characteristics of a successful company, a successful proposal rests on 3 pillars. You have something really unique and different as a technical innovation that meets the needs of the agency. If it's a really general agency like NSF, it has to impress essentially peer reviewers. But if it's in the case of a contracting agency like DoD, you could have the greatest idea in the world, but they have to want it. Technical innovation is one thing, technical merit. The second thing is that there has to be a market for it. There has to be commercial need. And the third thing is you have to have either at least 1 or 2 people in the company as a qualified research team and ability to get more people on your team when needed, and to have access to resources such as the labs that the Boron Specialty Group had. So anyway, that's about my quick overview of what makes at least a good idea for someone to apply and create a successful proposal. But of course, I wouldn't have a job if there wasn't a lot more nuance in how to pitch it and meet the requirements of proposal. Over to someone.
Sure. So I'm going to ask a question from Ken Schreiber, and I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit and then open it up to any of you, because I honestly don't know which one of you specifically might have a better answer. So apparently there have been a couple of abusers, and the Office of Inspector General for funding agencies have been scrutinizing more closely the conflict of interest and percent interest for STTR grants. So I was wondering if any of you know how this impacts the restrictions, or how private companies collaborating with academic institutions on STTRs might be impacted, or what the distribution of effort might be.
I don't know. Do the Bosleys want to tackle that? Otherwise, I feel like I'm doing all the talking, so I'll be really brief if they don't want to.
Yeah, I think this is not a topic that we've really encountered, so we'd certainly defer to you, Leon.
Okay, thanks. All right, I thought I'd give it a shot. So anyway, Ken's question is a good one, and it's basically there's a lot of scrutiny on fraud, waste, and abuse, in particular if there's any conflicts of interest for academic researchers, and if owning a share of a company represents a conflict of interest on something like an STTR. So it's a little bit of a specialty case, but it's the broader question of fraud, waste, and abuse has definitely been in the news lately, and there are examples of prosecutions where people have fake data and illegally used money, not necessarily relevant to this question. But with regard to academic researchers and specific conflicts of interest, I'll split the question into two parts. One is on the fraud side. You definitely have to make sure that that the academic researcher, particularly if they're the PI, is not essentially getting paid for more than 100% of their time on a full-time basis, and that they've legally disclosed everything. And also is doing the work they claim, and that everything that they're doing has been properly disclosed. And there's forums and other things to do that. Now that's an easy thing to kind of hew to the letter of the law, and it's just a matter of not breaking the law and going to jail, which is probably something most startups want to avoid. So the second part of the question on conflict of interest is a lot trickier, and I'm not sure I'm going to fully be able to answer Ken's question, but in general, I do not believe the government really feels that there's an issue with a founder essentially spinning off a company and remaining an academic person and still being the PI. The agency itself wants to see those technology transitions, and in general probably would like to encourage researchers to both put their money where their test tubes are and put their put their time into spinning out companies instead of staying in the lab. But where that does really break down is the conflict of interest requirements, and whether or not they're doing anything unethical, such as funneling money from an SBIR grant, which is intended to commercialize a product, back into their lab at a university for non-commercialization related activity, like something that is more pure research that isn't quite necessary for the SBIR or STTR project. So you have to be really careful about that. And very often the university will have a conflict of interest policy, or at least a review process that you can protect yourself against by going through. I know OSU has a nice one, and it usually doesn't prevent any awards from going forward, but it does advise founders on where they should be careful. But in general, there is not a hard line between the academic company and the spending and the small business spending. And I see there's another related question from Skip. Do you want me just to read that one, Anna?
Or go for it, Leon.
Okay, thanks. Skip Rung from Onami in Corvallis asks a really good question about whether or not this is potentially related to abuse of grad students and who are directing their work on behalf of a company. And that is another form of fraud also, where you could potentially be using a university grad student for something that is more in the interest of the small business, but paying them to basically do things that aren't necessarily for their, say, thesis or purely academic work. And again, the COI policy should prevent that. And this is such a specialized case that I'm not sure the that I can answer with a one size fits all answer, except that, you want to be, in some cases, a grad student or a postdoc may very well want to go with a startup. So that is certainly a happy win-win situation where they can do their thesis work under university-sponsored research, but then potentially do SBIR or STTR funded work under the company boundary. Just make sure it's really clear. But in cases where a grad student is clearly just doing things to graduate and then pursue a different career, the researcher or the company should be careful to avoid the COIs.
Yeah.
And I definitely want to go to other subjects and give my voice a break. Go ahead, Anna.
I was just going to give a quick plug as a graduate student who did get bit by the entrepreneurial bug and earned my doctoral dissertation into a technology and a spin-out technology in a company. The right graduate student who is self-motivated and moving in that direction can be phenomenal. The wrong grad student, does feel very obligated to their faculty member and will do what they are asked of them, and that's really not a great position. But I've talked with a number of faculty members and gone through the NSF I-Corps program that faculty members tend to be surprised that they can't keep their faculty job and be the CEO of a company. That's very, very rare. So finding the right grad student or postdoc who can take a technology and turn it into a company and wants to make that transition, that may be your biggest resource as well for translating these technologies. So I had one question for Brett and Beth as it came up. So it sounds like you've turned down a lot of private equity or investment from either contacts in the industry or outside investors. And I was just curious about the logic behind that.
Yeah, I can start, and then maybe Brett can give his perspective as well. So I wouldn't say we've turned down investment. We've had a lot of discussions with a number of private equity companies and also a number of chemical companies who sort of liked our business model of introducing new products and thought we might be a good fit to be consumed by them. For one reason or another, the deals haven't worked out. Either it could have been us who didn't like the deal or them in the end who didn't like our financials, for instance. But we decided to go on our own, at least up until this point, because we could see a clear path for ourselves. Brett might have additional information.
Well, I think part of it as well is we're still relatively small. We've grown nicely over the years, but as I sort of alluded to before, there can be caps on your rate of growth based on your ability to make investments. We'd love to have a 100-gallon reactor system, but we're not quite there yet. And so as a result, we punch above our weight in terms of appearance, the number of products we've introduced, the set of customers we have, the kinds of chemistries we do. But the scale of the company from an EBITDA, and that's a term of art if you haven't heard that before, it's essentially the profitability of the company. A private equity fund, and maybe to digress quickly, private equity is a really important kind of capital and operating model in the chemical industry right now. It's a small, medium, and even sometimes a large enterprise scale. And there's some funds that are doing really interesting things in operating companies, combining them and so forth. So we're very interested in that space. We know we can exit, at any time when the multipliers on our financial performance look right to us. Some of the strategic discussions that we've had that Beth alluded to as well, that's more of are we really adding value to the extent we want to be able to, are we able to continue the growth of the company that we've built so far? And a couple of those conversations are, let's stay in touch. Some of them are, we looked at it and well, let's stay friends and do business together. So I think it's just a constant discussion with one potential partner or another. Before I forget, and I want at some point I want to turn the table on you. You mentioned I-Corps. And I'm actually on the board of a couple of national labs, and I've worked a lot in that space. pretty familiar with how successful that program is in helping, whether it's grad students or professors or PIs or staff members at a research institution, to gain insight on what it takes to launch companies. I'd turn it around and ask you if you wanted to comment on your experience there, because I think it's a great program.
Yeah, I'm call myself an I-Corps fangirl. It's fantastic. So just a quick background. The NSF has, I believe, led the I-Corps program, but I believe there are NIH and other smaller programs now because it's been so successful. And it sometimes gets mislabeled as a like pre-SBIR. And I think even if you are an academic group or a small early stage SBIR recipient, you can go through a mini I-Corps program. But my graduate advisor and my business mentor and I went through last year was the NSF program. It's 6 weeks long. You apply. It's not normal NSF applications. It's a bunch of, 1 or 2 page outline documents and then some phone meetings. So, not those big forms you have to fill out, which can be prohibitive. And so it's then 6 weeks of extremely intensive market or learning how to do market analytics, learning how to talk to people, learning how to do customer discovery is really the key phrase I like to use, but it's basically taking an idea or a discovery that you have and finding out if anybody wants to pay money for it. And it's a very simple question, but talking to people and getting ideas of how they operate and behave and what they may actually do is surprisingly difficult. And there's a couple of really interesting things you learn as a scientist, is that talking to people, they will say something to your face to make you happy, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's what they mean, or it's what they will do, or that's how they actually operate. And so it's a very, very non-scientific lesson in marketing. But it's a crash course for entrepreneurs, for young scientific entrepreneurs. It's entirely geared towards scientists. So we know how to make a graph really well. They know that we're, sometimes still struggle with eye contact. And it's great. So if you are associated with the university, you're either a student or a faculty member, I highly, highly recommend looking into the NSF I-Corps program. Your university should have a lot of resources, should have a patent translation office or a strategic partnership office. I can tell you all about the one at PSU, a little bit about the one at OSU. I don't know much about U of O, but universities should have these and they should be excited to help you get through this. And then the other funding opportunity I was just going to pitch really quickly is a lot of universities do have venture development funds. So getting in touch with your office early on when you're starting a company, thinking about a company, or exploring this path, finding out what resources are available. Universities have become very friendly towards helping their students not just get jobs, but create their own jobs these days. And so your university is a great resource if you are associated with the university. And do I-Corps if you can. It's great. You'll probably cry, but it's still great. So Brett, you said you were involved in the I-Corps program. Have you ever been an industry mentor on an I-Corps team?
I've not. I'd be happy to do that if I have the opportunity. No, I more had an opportunity to meet a number of people that had been through it, teams and individuals, and I can't think of one that wasn't as enthusiastic as you are, and in many cases went on to do something. Well, in some cases went back to their lab and continued either their studies or teaching or whatever, and in other cases started companies. So it was probably one of the most effective, certainly nationwide programs that I've seen to give people that kind of insight, because you're right, it's talking to the customer that's so critical and often so hard. So anyway, thanks for taking that question.
Yeah, it's as you mentioned, I think it also helps a lot to faculty members who are excited about startups or translating their technology, understand what their role is going to be in that technology translation. And it can be very surprising that you really, being a CEO of a company or being an entrepreneur is a full-time job, and it's very difficult to be both a faculty member and an entrepreneur. But there definitely is a space for faculty members who want to help translate their technologies, and knowing how that can work and what role you can play can be really helpful. So yeah, I also want to give a quick plug for Virtue Labs. Leon, you want to run this and maybe talk a little bit about some of their programs?
Sure, and I also have a quick shout out to my colleague Tricia Clemens, who's on the phone and just posted a great comment that university accelerators in general are great resources, and both the Portland State Business Accelerator and the OSU Advantage Accelerator should be considered for the Oregon folks that are online. But with regard to the rest of Virtue Lab, as I mentioned earlier, it's an economic development-oriented nonprofit that operates primarily in the clean tech, sustainability, and renewable energy space, and is lately zeroing in on creating a fund for climate impact solutions and technology. But Virtue Lab's been in existence in Oregon, I think, for 11 years now, and it started out in Oregon Best and is partly funded by the state of Oregon. Thanks if Mark Brady is on the phone, but I don't think he is. Anyway, Virtue Lab provides a range of services. Now, this is besides SBIR support, but specifically to those in the clean tech and sustainability industries. We have a clean tech oriented accelerator called Cascadia, which runs once a year and creates a cohort of Oregon, Washington, and Alaska and BC companies for entrepreneurial training, and goes in much more depth on things like fundraising. And that is applied once a year. So watch the virtuelab.org website, which let's see, I think this would be over my right shoulder. And seek to apply in the next window. It's currently running now for 2020. There's also some other offerings and internships for assistance. We have our annual conference, which is called Fuel this year. And because of COVID, will be virtual in September. And again, go to the website to sign up for Fuel 2020, which is again in primarily in the clean tech space. And then finally, again, watch the Virtue Lab website. There should be an investment fund, and this will be a true fund which takes equity in a company, which will be opening sometime in hopefully the end of this year. And is going to be somewhat similar, in case people know Oregon Best history, will be somewhat similar to the commercialization gap fund, which existed funded by the state of Oregon for most of the last part of the decade. So anyway, with that, let's see. I don't know if we're supposed to wrap up at 1, Anna, do you?
Yeah, I think we're going to wrap up
Okay.
unless anybody has any last pressing issues.
Yeah, I'd be glad to answer any questions. And I also should mention we're happy, and this is such a great event. And we're happy to be involved with ACS and hope to see everyone next year.
Yeah. So
hopefully live.
with that said, Brett and Beth, if you have any closing thoughts you'd like to impart, or anything else you'd like to add?
I'll just say quickly, the discussion about accelerators and clean tech reminded me that there's another form of relatively rare capital, but worth thinking about if you're in that space, which is philanthropy, both corporate and in some cases family offices that have an interest in things like climate or renewable energy, that sort of thing. And the on-ramp for that is often an accelerator or an incubator that has an affiliation with those. So it's something to think about in that space. But other than that, we really appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit of our experience and hopefully, you give some ideas if you're thinking about starting a business. It absolutely is possible. It's terrifying and gratifying, I guess. So, thank you.
And just a last few pieces of advice, I guess, for me, I'd say, as Brett said, this is a very gratifying and also terrifying thing to do, is to start a company, especially when you start hiring employees. And I'd say if you're going to go after money, my best advice to you is to learn as much as you can about the money you're going after so that you know what their criteria are. And you know, if you're not going to meet their criteria, there's really no reason to go and get shot down by investors. So I think you need to practice your pitch. Make sure you meet the criteria for whatever investment fund you're going after. And if you are going to start out with, say, an SBIR, make sure you're perfectly aligned with what the government needs, because there is a lot of overhead that comes with that. So best of luck to everybody. And I think, anybody is welcome to give out my contact information if anybody would like to talk privately.
Thanks, Beth. That led me to one last quick thought that just builds on Beth's. Knowing who you're pitching to is a book I really enjoyed called Marketing for Scientists. That's the whole thesis, but it's told in a great story. And it's a really great way as a scientist starting to think about how to market, how to sell, how to pitch your idea or your business to somebody else. So again, it's a book called Marketing for Scientists.
Thank you, Anna. This is Ken Schreiber. I'm not Jim Tung, but I know him. Jim and I are colleagues. I also am on the Portland section of the American Chemical Society, and he had to move on to another meeting, so asked me to close. I will say that as someone who has built, I was part of building a fairly successful small chemical company in the 90s. And then after some time back at the university, I went to develop another small company that was SBIR funded. The first one that was built using bootstrapping was, as I mentioned, very successful. The second one was a total train wreck. So there's been very valuable information provided today. The bottom line is all money has strings attached. And as Anna just emphasized and Beth mentioned, I mean, all of our panelists have emphasized, know what those strings are. So thank you again, Anna and the panel, Beth, Brett, Leon. Would ask all of you who are still online to join us again tomorrow. Same time, we will be having the Practice Your Pitch session, where science entrepreneurs who are just like you will be presenting their pitches in front of 3 experienced pitch coaches: Rita Hansen of Onboard Dynamics, Skip Rung of Onami, and Genevieve Lemarchal of Adventurine. And with that, I will close the meeting and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye all.
Thank you again, panelists.
Well, maybe.